In this chapter, I am going to explore hard edges and how to control the surface quality of your models. Now, what we have here is we have 3 steps and 8 cubes. If I was to subdivide these, however, you'll notice that they all change in shape. Now, what exactly causes this? I mean, what we have here is we have one of the steps turn into an object that has a high degree curvature. Then, as we make our way to the right, you get less and less curvature until you get a very sharp step. On the bottom, the cubes also changed in shape quite dramatically. You have one cube that turned into a sphere, and as we make our way to the right through these examples, they become less and less spherical until they retain their shape closer. Then, of course, on the bottom we have one that turned into a bullet and another one that turned into a cylinder, and so on. So what exactly did I do to change these models into the way they are right now? If I unsubdivide these and I show you the wireframe, you can also look at the wireframe by going to Advanced OpenGL, Shade Options, Wireframe, and turn on Colored. In this case, I'm just going to use my hotkey. So when you look at these, you'll notice that every single one of these has a very different edge configuration. And this is really the heart of what controls your subdivision surfaces. Your different edge configurations control how your model will look when you subdivide it. So here you'll notice that it's just 2 polygons, and when I subdivide it, it really turns into a high degree curvature. Then we have more edges, and of course there's a slightly lower curvature in this model, and the closer those edges get, the harder the crease becomes. But there's a little bit more to it. I mean, more or less, that's the idea, but there's many ways in which you can use it. So in this chapter, this is exactly what we're going to explore. How to control the surface quality of your models, and just overall be able to take advantage of this aspect of modeling to create more elaborate and more compelling models. Before I go into further detail of exactly what happens in theory when you add more edges to a corner or any area of your model, especially when you're subdivided, so before we understand what happens underneath the hood, I'm just going to go through a few quick examples. So let me just go and bevel this one edge here, like that. So this is going to be a wide bevel. Let me bevel this one a little bit less, and this one even less. At the same time, to these top edges, what I'm going to do is I'm going to subdivide at about, I don't know, 30%, closer to this edge here, and like that. So the distance between these edges is great. I'm also going to do the same thing, but with a smaller percentage. Something like that. And one where it's fairly tight to that corner. So what we have is we have edges that we've beveled, the original edges, except the distance gets closer and closer in example 3. So example 1, example 2, example 3. And same thing in the above step. You have edges that were added to these polygons, and they are getting closer and closer towards example 3. So when I subdivide this model, you will notice that in the original we have a lot of curvature happening. In the second example, there's still curvature happening, but it's a little tighter than the first example, especially noticeable here. You'll notice that there is curvature, but you also have a little bit more of a flat plane on the actual step. And of course, in the third example, the first polygon is pretty much flat, the last polygon is pretty much flat, and of course, where there is only one edge down the center between the steps, you'll notice that there is curvature happening here. So now that we know that once you add more and more edges towards a corner, or the closer the detail gets, the sharper the corners become. But let's look at why. So let's look at things from a 2D perspective. Now I'm going to go back into Modo for 1 second, and if I look at this step, or speck from the side, you'll notice that I have 1, 2, and 3 vertices, and this is exactly how it looks from a 2D perspective, or rather a 3D perspective, but from a side view. If I go back into Photoshop, you'll notice that I have something fairly similar. This is an illustration of what that model looks like from the side view. Now, before we go ahead and subdivide this and kind of predict what's going to happen if I were to add more data to this model, if I was going to, for example, add more vertices towards this corner, before I do that, let's look at what happens when you generally smooth raw geometry. So without subdividing, let's just smooth it. Well, generally when you're smoothing geometry, you're smoothing everything between endpoints. So I have my endpoint number 1, I have my inside geometry, or rather this vertex on the inside, so I'm going to name that point number 2, and my point number 3 is once again an end point. So endpoints rarely, if ever, in subdivision algorithms, do they ever move. These 2 points will remain stationary. So I'm going to smooth all of this. Now if I was going to apply 100% smoothing between these 2 lines, what you would get is you would get a straight line between point 1 and point 3. A 50% smoothing would be essentially something like that. This would be a 75% smooth, and so on. And this would be a 25% smooth. Now, when you're... Oh yeah, and by the way, point number 2 would be displaced down to there. So now this is mostly dealing with smoothing raw geometry. So what happens when you subdivide? Well, we already looked at subdividing in a previous video, but let's recap it here just for, just for kicks. So in order to subdivide a model, what you have to do is you have to add a new vertex down the center of every single edge and a new vertex down the center of the polygon. And then of course you connect these two, or these new points. At the same time, you have to take the old vertices and you have to displace them. So you're going to smooth these edges out and these vertices will be displaced. So remember, if I was going to apply 100% smoothing to these, we already know what would happen. We would get a straight line. Now we don't want a straight line, and I'm just going to make a visual aid for myself here. That is what 100% smoothing would look like, and 50% smoothing is about here. It's halfway between this. So if I go back to my red color and connect the dots, this is the result that I would get. My new polygon, or my new edges, have been smoothed about 50%, and my result is like this. So now let's continue drawing that between the rest of the points. So again, 50% is here, here, and here. So if I just connect the dots, my actual polygon, and you know what, I'm going to erase these yellow edges because they're not needed anymore. So yeah, so what ends up happening is my subdivided geometry ends up looking like this. I end up, instead of with one polygon like I had originally, I end up with 1, 2, 3, 4 polygons, and of course the edges have been smoothed over, so now the geometry has become a little bit rounder. So now that we know what happens when you subdivide, let's look at practical examples. So this example number 3 is more or less what example number 1 was, except that the main difference, what we're going to do now, is we're going to now subdivide the model and we're going to smooth it. So in example number 1, we only smoothed it without actually having to have had subdivided it. So let's subdivide it and let's see what smoothing does to it as well. Because remember, when you subdivide a model, you're not only smoothing, or you're not only subdividing, but you're also smoothing. So you're subdividing and smoothing all in one. Okay, so example number 3, we know already what we have to do in order to subdivide a model. We have to add a new vertex down the center of each edge, and then we have to evaluate what's the difference angle between these two edges. Well, in this case, it's 0. The edge just keeps traveling straight. This edge and this edge, same angle. So we draw a straight line. And of course, the same thing happens to the bottom here. Now, the angle between here is fairly large, and we already know what to do here. If I was going to draw, once again, a straight line between here, 50% would be here. So let's connect the dots, and our new result is like that. And of course, let me erase that guide. So that's what happens for example number 3. When you originally have only 3 vertices, so originally we have 1, 2, and 3, this red result is what happens, or rather, the red result is your subdivision surface after, well, it's been subdivided. Example number 4 introduces a few extra, or rather one extra vertex. So what I've done is I've taken vertex number 2 and I've beveled it, and of course this is the result that you get. So 1, 2, 3, and 4 are the vertices that I have here. And now let's subdivide this. So I'm going to have to, of course, add a new vertex in the center of each edge. And then I start evaluating the difference here. So the difference between these two straight lines is, well, 0. So let me just draw a straight line. Of course, the difference between here and here is slight. I mean, it's not huge, but there is a slight difference there. So of course, a straight line, and you know what, let me just increase the value here. Between here and here would be that. 50% would be essentially around there. So I connect the dots like that. And of course, I do the same thing to the bottom. So if we look at the difference between example number 3 and number 4, you'll notice that there is still a curve happening here, but it's not as great as example number 3. Example number 4 still has a curve, but it's a little bit more focused towards the corner, just slightly. Now, what happens when we bring more geometry in the corner? Well, let's take a look. Let's subdivide all of this geometry here. So every single one of these edges gets a new vertex. And of course, the difference between this edge and this edge is 0. So let's just draw a straight line. Same thing here. Again, difference between this edge and this edge is 0. So let's continue drawing a straight line. And let's do the same thing for the bottom. Again, difference between here and here is 0. So continue drawing a straight line. And now we come to the corner where we have a higher degree of an angle. And if I was going to zoom into this and switch colors to draw a connection between here and then draw a 50% point, I now know where my points connect. So my result ends up being, and if I just zoom out a little bit, okay. So number 5 is the result for when you have more vertices in a corner. So when I look at all these, what do I learn? Well, what I learn is that the more geometry you have on the original geometry, the more geometry you have towards a corner, the harder the edges will become. The less geometry you have over a span like this, the more curve you will get. So now we're going to go into some more practical examples. So now I'm going to look at the examples inside of Modo. Now, if I look at this from the side once again, you'll notice that this is what I have. And of course, inside of Photoshop, this is pretty much the same. So example number 3 had originally 1, 2, and 3 vertices from the side. When I look at Modo, I have 1, 2, 3 vertices from the side. So when I subdivide this, when I press Shift and Tab, I'm going to get a model that has a higher degree curve. And that's pretty much exactly what I ended up getting inside of Photoshop. So I ended up with this geometry right here. There's a high degree curve. When I go back to Photoshop, I look at example number 3. That's exactly what I had. I had 3 original vertices. And when I subdivided it, the subdivision surface ended up looking like this. In example number 4, I'm going to go back into Modo. I'm going to go to example number 4. We end up with a model like this. End up with 1, 2, 3, 4 vertices from the side. 1, 2, 3 edges. And of course, when I subdivide this, you end up with something similar to the other example, but the difference is that you'll notice that the lines, that the subdivision surface is in fact slightly different. And of course, the reason why it's different is because there's more data towards that corner. So in this case, there's more data in around this corner, and that makes the curve come closer and closer towards that corner. And of course, when we look at back in Photoshop, that's exactly what we get. We had 1, 2, 3, 4 original vertices, and when you subdivide it and then smooth it, the subdivision surface automatically smooths it, ends up looking like this. Example number 5, if I go back into Modo once again, and I go to my next example, what you'll notice is that I have a model that has more data coming towards a corner. When I look at it from the side, you'll notice that I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 vertices. And of course, in Photoshop, that's exactly what I had. Let me just draw that very quickly. I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 original vertices. And of course, when I ended up smoothing all of this, I ended up getting a model that more or less retained its shape a lot more better than all the previous examples. Let me go back into Modo. And of course, when I subdivide this, you'll notice that this model retains its shape a lot better than everything else that I had previously. And there is a slight curvature towards the corner. Now let me compare all these models together from the side. You'll notice that, hold on. Okay, so what you'll notice here is that the more data I had in my examples towards a corner, the more I retained my shape. The less I had, the less I retained the shape. So let's look at this a little bit further. What happens when I move these edges closer and further away? Well, let me just subdivide this, and this is my subdivided result. And I'm going to just move these edges while the model is subdivided. I'm just going to press W now, and I'm going to move my edges around the corner that are getting closer and closer to the corner. I'm going to rather move them further away. And what you'll notice is exactly what we would have expected. We're getting more and more curvature because these edges are moving further away. So let me move those edges back in, and you'll notice that the corner is starting to get sharper. I'm getting more shape retention. So that's pretty much the idea behind hard edges when you subdivide. If you want to control your surface better, remember, put more points in an area and you're going to retain the shape a lot better. If you want very controlled curvatures, have less data in those areas. And that's pretty much, what hard edges are all about. Before I finish with this section here, I wanted to go back into the tools that I'm going to be working on in this series. And what I wanted to explore here specifically is I just wanted to show you a quick example of how hard edges can be used in modeling. What you'll notice, especially in these wrenches here, is that there are some hard edges on the tops of the heads of the wrenches. And then of course there's transitions that move into the body or the handle. And of course here you have a very smooth transition into the overall wrench or the head. And then of course towards the top and bottom of the wrench you have hard edges. Of course here you have a nice smooth transition in the wrench head, and of course you end up with very hard edges towards the corners, and of course you end up having a much harder edge over here rather than on this part of the model. So knowing exactly how to place your edges, knowing exactly how far to place them and what kind of angles to retain and whatnot, knowing what to do will go a very long way in you creating much more compelling models. Now this is going to come with experience, so you are going to have to make your own judgment, and you're going to find your own methods in controlling your models. But this is essentially an example of things that you can do. You'll notice that there's a lot of smooth transitions in and out, and of course this smooth transition turns into a sharp edge here. Of course you end up with a slightly sharper transition into the hammerhead, and of course this nice smooth transition turns into a hard edge, and of course into a flat end. And yeah, I mean, the more you know, or the more you practice with these, with this knowledge, the more you model, the more experience you're going to get with this, and you're going to make better and better judgments as you model in the future. So don't expect to get this right away, or rather, the idea is very simple, but don't expect to get perfect results right away. You're going to get this over a longer period of time, but I mean, everybody gets it. So anyways, good luck. The other method of applying hard edges to your models is by using the hard edge, or rather the edge weight tool within the vertex map menu. Now this applies itself to your models when your models are subdivided, so you can either press tab or shift tab. Now it really works best when you go down to geometry and just use the toggle Catmull-Clark subdivision, or well, shift tab in this case. So when I do that, I will have a Catmull-Clark subdivision surface, so this cube turned into a sphere, and when I press plus and minus on my numerical pad, you might not necessarily notice a difference right away, but if I go in and out of my subdivision surface by pressing shift tab, and again, you'll notice that it is now slightly smoother than what we had before. Now if I was going to select a few edges, like this, and then go into vertex map edge weight tool, and then click in the viewport and drag left or right, you'll notice that I'm adding or subtracting a hard edge. Now this method has been most recently implemented into Modo, and it is a very, very good way of adding hard edges to your models. The nice thing about this is that even after I've added these edges, I can reselect those edges, I can go back into vertex map edge weight tool, and I can subtract that hard edge or readjust it to the exact value that I want. Now the cool thing about this is that I can keep pressing plus or minus on my numerical pad, and again, I won't see the difference right now, but what if I go in and out? You'll notice that now the model is nice and smooth, except I have a very good control of all my geometry. So the cool thing about this is that it's almost a non-linear kind of approach to adding hard edges to your models. I don't necessarily have to add more geometry to make denser models to do this. Now, there are downsides to using this method of hard edges. The reason why I went into this video of explaining how to do the manual way of adding more geometry to your models so you can control your surface types, the reason why I went into that is so that you can now take that model that you've created with that very specific edge configuration and you can export it to any other application. Using this method here that I've just described in this portion of the video, the vertex map edge weight tool, if you use this method of adding hard edges to your models, you will not be able to export it to any other application. So this is the one major downside. However, there are ways to kind of get around this. So let me go into that now. Now imagine if I was to further model or further play around with this geometry, and I'm just extruding or beveling, and I'm going to change this shape slightly. So imagine that I'm going to create a very primitive shape here, and I'm going to readjust it slightly. And again, I'm just doing very, very basic modeling. So imagine that this is a very This is some sort of motorcycle shape, some kind of bicycle kind of thing. Not necessarily bicycle, but a futuristic hover bike or something like that. Now, if I subdivide this right now, it's going to look like this, which isn't very appealing. It's very round, very bubbly. What if I wanted some hard edges in this? Well, I could easily double click on this edge, double click on this edge to give me the edge loops here. I could then go into vertex map, edge weight tool, apply it to the surface. So now I have something like that, which is kind of cool. And then of course I could do the same thing here. And again, apply the edge weight tool to here. And now my result is like this, which is kind of cool. I could then of course select these two edges, go back to edge weight tool, and I could subtract the amount that has been applied to this, should I choose to. And of course, this is kind of slow in the way that it's applying right now because I have so many subdivisions, so many subdivision levels on this. But again, the cool thing is that I can go into any one of these edges. I can just select any of these edges and then smooth it. So when I mentioned the workaround for being able to export this geometry, what you would have to do is you would have to freeze this geometry. So let me just do that now. If I go into the geometry menu, you'll notice that there's a freeze button here. If I press that, it will take my subdivision surface and convert it into a regular model. So now when I show you the wireframe, if I go to Advanced OpenGL, Shade Options, Wireframe, Colored, you'll notice that there's a very dense mesh. Now I can't really do much with this. I mean, I could if I just use it as it is. I probably wouldn't be subdividing this model anymore, so I would be using it as raw geometry as it is right now. I could put this in a scene and I guess work with it. Or I could also take it into ZBrush and then further sculpt on this shape. So that's one of the cool things about working like this. I can very quickly prototype shapes using the edge weight tool. I can then export this specific geometry after it has been frozen, and then I can sculpt and retopologize it exactly as I want. So this is a very, very cool way of working. But I generally wouldn't use this as a way to generate shapes, or rather create my final models, because of the fact that it is very dense. So when you're giving your models to clients, I hope you're not giving models like this to your clients. Another thing you should also remember is that when you give a model like this to a client, and of course you have to UV this is a very dense mesh. UVing a very dense mesh will of course be a pain in your Heine. And it could also potentially crash Modo. Modo doesn't really like very big data sets, so the smaller and less dense your model is, the less geometry you have in your model, the easier it will be to UV. So that's it for this topic. Cheers. So finally, the homework section for the hard edges video. Now we have created some of these in the past, but I just hope that you guys attempt at recreating some of these. They are fairly simple. I mean, we have gone over all of them in the past. And of course, over here we have a kind of combination of everything that we've talked about. And on the bottom, we have some models that you could once again attempt. Now, I will not be showing you the wireframe for these examples here. Main reason being is that I really want you guys to challenge yourselves into creating these shapes. You don't necessarily have to create these right now. You could go ahead and finish watching the rest of these videos, or this video set. And of course, once you've finished watching the entire workshop, all the rest of the modeling videos, and once you have a better grasp of how modeling works, how Modo works, and how subdivision surfaces are affected by your edge configurations, once you know how to do all that, how to control curvature and hard edges, then you can go back to this chapter and attempt these two shapes in particular. They are fairly simple, but once again, newer users might have some trouble recreating these. So good luck and cheers.